Hello. Welcome to Crimson Noir.
The vicarage at Little Dinsford had always been regarded as a place of quiet reassurance. Its red brick walls, softened by age and ivy, stood slightly apart from the village green, as though modesty itself had chosen the site. People passed it daily without curiosity, confident that nothing improper could ever originate behind its orderly windows. Miss Jane Marple, however, had long held the view that reassurance was rarely accidental. She arrived that afternoon at the invitation of the vicar's wife, Mrs. Constance Avery, for what was described as a small and improving tea. The phrase alone was enough to pique Miss Marple's interest. Improving gatherings, she had found, often revealed more about human weakness than any openly scandalous affair. The drawing-room was already crowded when she entered. Teacups were aligned with careful precision, plates of sandwiches arranged symmetrically, and a thin layer of polite conversation floated above everything like gauze. Mrs. Avery presided from near the hearth, her expression alert and faintly strained, while the vicar himself moved among the guests with gentle smiles and an air of studied calm. Miss Marple took a seat near the window and began, as she always did, to observe. There was Mr. Lionel Brooks, the churchwarden, whose booming laugh never quite reached his eyes. Miss Edith Farnham, a tireless volunteer with a habit of remembering other people's mistakes more clearly than her own. Mrs. Penelope Grant, recently arrived from London, whose curiosity about village life was only thinly disguised as interest, and, seated slightly apart from the others, Mr. Rupert Hale, the vicarage secretary, bent over a stack of papers he had brought with him despite the social nature of the gathering. Miss Marple noticed that Mrs. Avery glanced at those papers more often than she did at her guests. Conversation turned, as it inevitably did, to village matters, a dispute over the fete committee, a whispered concern about a certain young couple seen walking together too often, small things delivered with indulgent smiles and sharpened by implication. "It's so important," Miss Farnham was saying, "that certain standards are upheld. One never knows what might happen otherwise." "Yes," Mrs. Grant replied lightly, "villages do have a way of remembering." Miss Marple folded her hands and listened. At last Mrs. Avery cleared her throat. "Before we finish our tea," she said, "there is something I wish to discuss, something that concerns us all." The room shifted subtly. Cups paused mid-air. Mr. Hale looked up sharply, his hand tightening on the papers. During some recent Lee, Mrs. Avery hesitated over the word, organization of the vicarage records, a number of old documents have come to light. Miss Marple felt that familiar inward stillness she had learned to trust. "These papers," Mrs. Avery continued, "contain information of a sensitive nature. Correspondence, notes, memoranda, matters that were never intended for general circulation." Mr. Brooks frowned. "What sort of matters?" Mrs. Avery smiled thinly. "Private ones." Miss Marple noticed how Mr. Hale's face had gone pale. "It is my belief," Mrs. Avery went on, "that such papers should be handled with discretion, for the good of the village." "And who decides what is good?" Mrs. Grant asked mildly. The question lingered, unwelcome. Before Mrs. Avery could respond, there came a sharp sound from the adjoining study, a heavy thud, followed by the unmistakable crash of something striking the floor. For a moment no one moved. Then the vicar spoke. That sounded odd. Mrs. Avery was already on her feet, moving toward the door with an urgency that broke through her composed exterior. The guests followed, drawn by that irresistible mixture of concern and curiosity. The study was dimmer than the drawing-room, its curtains half-drawn. Papers lay scattered across the desk and floor, as though disturbed by sudden movement, and there, slumped awkwardly beside the bookcase, was Mr. Rupert Hale. His eyes were open but unfocused. One arm lay stretched toward the desk, his fingers resting on a bundle of papers tied with faded ribbon. Dark blood spread slowly across his shirt, stark against the pale fabric. Mrs. Avery let out a short, strangled cry. Someone murmured a prayer. Someone else stepped back, knocking into a chair. The room filled with the sharp, metallic scent of blood and the heavier presence of shock. Miss Marple moved closer, unnoticed in the confusion. Her eyes went not first to the wound, but to the papers beneath Mr. Hale's hand. The ribbon had snapped. A single sheet lay half unfolded, its heading visible even at a distance. Confidential. Vicarage Records. Miss Marple felt no surprise, only a quiet confirmation. Mr. Hale had not stumbled, he had not fainted, he had been silenced. Behind her, the voices of little Dinsford rose and tangled, already shaping explanations, excuses, and reassurances. Someone spoke of accidents. Another mentioned Mr. Hale's heart. Mrs. Avery stood rigid, her gaze fixed not on the body, but on the scattered documents. Miss Marple straightened slowly. This was no crime of passion, nor of sudden violence. It was an interruption, a deliberate one. The Vicarage Murder Papers, it seemed, had been read by the wrong man. And someone, Miss Marple knew with quiet certainty, had decided that they must never be read again. The room held its breath for a moment, as though even the vicarage itself were reluctant to acknowledge what lay on the carpet. Then sound returned all at once. Chairs scraping, a woman's sharp intake of breath, the vicar's voice trying to impose calm on something that did not wish to be calmed. "Please," Reverend Avery said, stepping forward with hands slightly raised. "Everyone, do stay back. Constance, give him air." Mrs. Avery did not move. Her face had gone very pale, and her eyes kept flicking toward the papers on the floor with a fixed intensity that had nothing to do with grief. Miss Marple noticed that at once. People who were truly shocked looked at the body. People who were frightened looked at what the body had been holding. Mr. Lionel Brooks cleared his throat loudly, as though noise might make the situation more manageable. "We should send for the doctor," he said, with the authority of someone accustomed to making decisions when others hesitated. "Yes," Miss Edith Farnham agreed, though her voice trembled. "Dr. Selwyn at once." Mrs. Penelope Grant, who had stepped back into the doorway, pressed a hand to her mouth. "Oh dear," she murmured, and Miss Marple observed that her eyes were bright, not with tears but with a sharp, avid focus. Some people greeted tragedy as an invitation. Mr. Brooks strode from the room with purposeful steps, already calling for someone to fetch the doctor and the constable. Miss Farnham hovered near Mrs. Avery, offering a hand that did not quite touch her arm. Constance Avery finally spoke, her voice thin. "It must have happened just now. He was here only a moment ago, and he was quite well." Miss Grant asked, too quickly. Mrs. Avery's eyes snapped toward her. He had no reason to be unwell. The vicar bent over Mr. Hale, fingers searching for a pulse with an awkward delicacy. His hands shook slightly. "There's blood," he said, as though this were an unexpected detail rather than the central fact. "My God, there's blood." Miss Marple moved closer, still without drawing attention. She did not kneel. She had never found kneeling necessary to see. From where she stood, she could make out more of the document beneath Mr. Hale's hand. The heading remained, and beneath it a line of smaller type, partly obscured by the torn ribbon. Correspondence, 19 to 19. The dates were smudged, but the impression was clear. These were not recent notes about hymn sheets or parish visits. These were older, buried things. Dr. Selwyn arrived quickly, his coat damp from rushing through the mist outside. He pushed past the clustered guests with professional impatience, knelt, and examined the body with brisk efficiency. His mouth tightened as he straightened. "I'm afraid Mr. Hale is dead," he said. And it wasn't his heart. Mrs. Grant's breath caught theatrically. Miss Farnham whispered, "Oh Lord," as if prayer could undo what had already been done. The vicar closed his eyes briefly, then opened them with a steadiness that looked practiced. What happened to him?" Reverend Avery asked. Dr. Selwyn gestured toward the dark stain spreading beneath Mr. Hale's shoulder. "A wound, likely a knife or sharp instrument. I won't speculate beyond that, but you will need the police. We've sent for the constable," Mr. Brooks said, returning, slightly breathless but pleased to be useful. "He'll call Inspector Marsh from Brackley. Mrs. Avery made a small sound, almost inaudible. "Police," she whispered, as though the word itself were vulgar. Dr. Selwyn's gaze shifted to the scattered papers. "No one is to touch anything," he said, voice firm. "Not the body, not the documents, nothing." Mrs. Avery's hand twitched toward the nearest sheet, then stopped. Miss Marple saw that hesitation and filed it away. The instinct to tidy was rarely innocent when papers were involved. P.C. Larkin arrived within minutes, young and earnest, his face paling when he saw the scene. He repeated Dr. Selwyn's instruction with unnecessary volume, then tried to herd everyone back into the drawing room. "Please, if you'll all return, Inspector Marsh will want to speak with you. No one is to leave the vicarage grounds until then." This caused immediate protest. "I have dinner on," Miss Farnham said, scandalized. "My husband is expecting me," another woman insisted. "This is quite ridiculous," Mr. Brooks declared, though he did not move. The vicar raised a hand gently. "Please cooperate. It's the proper thing, proper." Miss Marple thought how often that word appeared when people were trying to keep panic at bay. They were gathered back into the drawing room, where the tea sat abandoned, cups cooling on saucers, sandwiches drying at the edges. The room looked absurd now, like a stage set left behind after the play had turned tragic. People formed small clusters, speaking in whispers that rose and fell with the same pattern: shock, suspicion, reassurance, and then, inevitably, curiosity. "Who was in the study?" someone asked. "I saw Mrs. Avery near the corridor," another replied. "Mr. Hale was always in that study," Mr. Brooks said loudly. "Always working, and on what exactly?" "Mrs. Grant murmured, her tone light but edged. Miss Marple sat near the window, as she had before, and listened. She watched Mrs. Avery closely. The vicar's wife did not join the clusters. She remained seated stiffly near the hearth, hands clasped tightly in her lap, staring at the empty space beyond the teapot as though her mind were elsewhere. The vicar moved among the guests, offering soft words, but his eyes kept darting toward the corridor, toward the study, toward whatever lay beyond the closed door. Miss Marple's attention returned to Mr. Rupert Hale as she had seen him earlier, apart from the group, bent over papers, a man who carried documents as others carried umbrellas. People like that were rarely murdered for personal charm. They were murdered for what they knew or for what they refused to hide. When Inspector Marsh finally arrived, he brought with him the steady calm of experience. He greeted no one politely. He simply took in the room, the faces, the strained silences, and then said, "Right, start from the beginning." He spoke first with the vicar and Mrs. Avery, then with Mr. Brooks. Statements were taken, times were noted, movements were traced. Inspector Marsh asked who had gone near the study during tea, who had left the drawing room, who had handled the records. When he asked about Mrs. Avery's announcement, about the old documents and their sensitive nature, Miss Marple saw a ripple of discomfort pass through the room. People avoided one another's eyes. The suggestion of papers had already done its work. It had reminded them that reputations were delicate things. Inspector Marsh asked to see the study. When he emerged later, his expression had tightened slightly. "There are documents missing," he said. "Someone removed something in a hurry. Mrs. Avery's head lifted sharp. "Missing?" "Yes," the inspector replied. And Mr. Hale died with his hand on a bundle labelled Confidential Vicarage Records. That seems relevant. Miss Marple watched Mrs. Avery's fingers tighten. The vicar's jaw clenched. Inspector Marsh's eyes travelled across the room and, for a brief moment, settled on Miss Marple. Not because she had spoken. She had not, but because experienced men recognised experienced observers. "You were here when the tea began?" he asked her. "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "And when Mrs. Avery spoke about the papers, and what did you notice?" he asked. Miss Marple paused just long enough to be polite. "That Mr. Hale looked frightened," she said softly. "Not surprised, frightened, and that Mrs. Avery looked as though she wished those papers had never been found at all." A hush fell, thin and uneasy. Inspector Marsh nodded slowly, as if that fit into a shape he was already forming. "Thank you, Miss Marple." Miss Marple folded her hands again and said no more. She did not need to, because in Little Dinsford the vicarage had always stood for reassurance, and now, with Mr. Hale dead and the confidential papers disturbed, reassurance had become the one thing everyone wanted most, and the one thing no one could safely offer. By the following morning, Little Dinsford had entered that peculiar state which always followed an unexpected death, a blend of solemnity and suppressed excitement that no one cared to admit to. The vicarage gates remained closed, yet villagers passed them more often than usual, slowing their steps, glancing up at the windows, constructing narratives with each look. Miss Marple observed it all during her morning walk. She stopped briefly at the green, where small knots of people stood pretending to discuss the weather while carefully exchanging fragments of information. No one spoke loudly. Names were dropped cautiously, as though sound itself might be dangerous. "They say Inspector Marsh was there half the night," one woman murmured, "and that Mr. Hale was mixed up in all sorts of things," another replied, eyes bright with a mixture of fear and anticipation. Miss Marple continued on, her pace unhurried. Villagers, she knew, did not wait for facts before forming opinions. They preferred outlines. Those could be filled in later. Inspector Marsh had set up his temporary base in the vicarage drawing-room. The study door remained locked, guarded by an officer who looked faintly embarrassed by his importance. Mrs. Avery sat rigidly on a straight-backed chair, receiving cups of tea she did not drink. The vicar moved restlessly between rooms, offering assistance that was neither requested nor particularly useful. Miss Marple was invited to remain, largely because no one quite knew how to ask her to leave. Inspector Marsh began his questioning systematically. Times were confirmed, movements retraced. Each guest described their position during tea with meticulous care, as though accuracy might serve as a shield. Miss Edith Farnham spoke at length about being in the drawing-room throughout, her voice quavering with what she insisted was shock. Mrs. Penelope Grant admitted she had stepped into the corridor briefly, but only to admire the vicarage photographs. Mr. Brooks placed himself firmly among the guests, loudly declaring that he had not left the room at all. Miss Marple noticed how often he repeated it. When Inspector Marsh questioned Mrs. Avery, the atmosphere tightened. "I was arranging the tea," she said. "Then I spoke to the guests. I did not leave the drawing-room until I heard the noise." "And Mr. Hale?" the inspector asked. "He excused himself shortly after I spoke," Mrs. Avery replied, her tone clipped. "He said he needed to check something." "Did he seem upset?" Inspector Marsh asked. Mrs. Avery hesitated just briefly. "He seemed preoccupied." Miss Marple thought that was a generous description. The vicar's account was simpler. He had been near the window, speaking with Mr. Brooks. He had heard the sound from the study and gone immediately to investigate. His distress appeared genuine, but Miss Marple noticed how carefully he avoided mentioning the papers. Inspector Marsh then turned his attention to the subject no one wished to address directly. "These documents," he said calmly, "the ones mentioned yesterday, I'd like to understand what they were. Mrs. Avery's lips tightened. Old correspondence, parish matters. Confidential parish matters, the inspector corrected. Enough to concern Mr. Hale. He was overly sensitive, Mrs. Avery said sharply. He worried about things that had long been settled. Such as? The inspector asked. Personal misunderstandings, she replied. Nothing criminal. Miss Marple thought of the word misunderstandings. It was often used to describe matters people preferred not to name. Later that morning, Inspector Marsh examined the study more thoroughly. Miss Marple was allowed to observe from the doorway. The room bore the signs of hurried disturbance. A chair lay slightly askew. One drawer had been pulled open with unnecessary force. On the desk, among neatly stacked files, lay a gap where something had been removed. The missing papers, the inspector murmured. He knelt near the bookcase where Mr. Hale had fallen. A faint scuff marked the rug, as though someone had shifted their weight suddenly. Nearby, partially hidden beneath the desk, was a letter opener, its blade wiped but not clean enough to escape notice. This would do it, Inspector Marsh said quietly. Miss Marple looked not at the blade, but at the desk. Among the remaining papers lay several envelopes marked in Mr. Hale's careful hand. Dates stretched back years. Some bore the vicarage seal, others did not. Someone trusted him, Miss Marple said gently. Yes, the inspector agreed. Enough to send him things they didn't want publicly known. And someone else feared that trust, Miss Marple added. By midday the news had reached every corner of the village. People remembered now that Mr. Hale had always been discreet, that he knew everyone's business without ever gossiping, that he had once quietly arranged matters so that embarrassment was avoided. He was very understanding, someone said. Too understanding, another replied. Miss Marple heard both remarks with equal interest. Inspector Marsh asked Miss Marple to walk with him later that afternoon. They circled the vicarage grounds, the autumn air cool and bracing. You've seen this sort of thing before, he said. Yes, Miss Marple replied. When people collect secrets, they rarely agree on how they should be used. You think the papers were dangerous, he said. I think they were powerful, she answered, and power frightens people who believe they deserve it exclusively. The inspector stopped near the garden wall. Someone killed Mr. Hale because he intended to act. Yes, Miss Marple said, not for what he had done, but for what he was about to do. And what was that? Inspector Marsh asked. Miss Marple considered. Either to expose something long hidden, or to refuse to keep hiding it. That evening, as dusk fell, Miss Marple returned to her lodging and sat quietly by the window. She reflected on the pattern emerging with uncomfortable clarity. A trusted keeper of papers, a sudden announcement about sensitive documents, a frightened man went to check on them, and a violent interruption before anything could be explained. Little Dinsford, she knew, had not merely lost a secretary, it had lost a mirror, and someone, somewhere in the village, had not liked what that mirror was about to show. By the second afternoon, the tension in Little Dinsford had sharpened into something brittle. The initial shock had faded, replaced by a restless need for clarity that the investigation stubbornly refused to provide. People wanted reassurance, and failing that, they wanted someone to blame. Inspector Marsh understood this instinct well and resisted it carefully. Miss Marple noticed that resistance in the way he asked questions. Instead of pressing for dramatic confessions, he invited repetition. He asked the same things twice, sometimes 3 times, at different moments, in different tones. The changes, when they came, were small enough that most people did not realize they had betrayed themselves. Mrs. Penelope Grant was among the first to be recalled. She arrived looking impeccably composed, curiosity restrained behind polite concern. You stepped into the corridor during tea, Inspector Marsh said mildly. Yes, Mrs. Grant replied, only briefly. I was admiring the photographs. And you didn't hear anything unusual? He asked. No, she said at once. Then, after a pause, well, I thought I heard voices, but I assumed it was someone in the study. More than one voice? The inspector asked. Mrs. Grant frowned as though searching her memory. Possibly. It was hard to tell. Miss Marple observed how Mrs. Grant's uncertainty appeared only after reflection. Initially her answers had been firm. That interested Miss Marple more than certainty ever could. Mr. Lionel Brooks was next. He entered with an air of injured dignity. I've already explained my position, he said. I was in the drawing room throughout. Yes, Inspector Marsh replied. And you were speaking with the vicar. That's right. Inspector Marsh leaned back slightly. About what? Mr. Brooks hesitated. About parish repairs. The roof, the inspector prompted. Yes, the roof. Miss Marple thought it curious how often roofs were discussed when people needed neutral topics. And you didn't leave his side? The inspector asked. No, Mr. Brooks said firmly. Then, with unnecessary emphasis, not for a moment. Miss Marple watched the flush creep up his neck. Later, Inspector Marsh turned his attention again to Mrs. Avery. The vicar's wife appeared controlled, but the strain was beginning to show in small ways. Her movements were sharper, her voice less modulated. You said Mr. Hale excused himself to check something, the inspector said. Did he say what? No, Mrs. Avery replied. Did you follow him? Inspector Marsh asked. Her eyes flashed. Certainly not. And yet, he continued calmly, you reached the study very quickly after the sound. Mrs. Avery stiffened. I was concerned. Concern can move people faster than curiosity, Miss Marple murmured quietly. Mrs. Avery turned toward her sharply, then checked herself. Inspector Marsh examined the study again that evening. Miss Marple joined him briefly. The room felt altered now, not just by the presence of death, but by attention. Objects seemed more deliberate, more expressive. Notice the desk, Miss Marple said softly. Everything is orderly except where something was removed. Yes, the inspector replied. And the missing bundle matches the broken ribbon. Someone didn't just take papers, Miss Marple said. They took a specific set and knew where to find it, he added. They stood in silence for a moment. That suggests familiarity, Inspector Marsh said, not a guest acting on impulse. No, Miss Marple agreed. This was someone who understood the importance of what Mr. Hale held. That evening, new information emerged from the vicar himself. He approached Inspector Marsh hesitantly, his face drawn. I should have said something earlier, he admitted, but I wasn't sure it mattered. Inspector Marsh waited. Rupert, Mr. Hale, came to me earlier that day, the vicar continued. Before the guests arrived, he was upset. About the papers? The inspector asked. Yes, the vicar said. He said some of them should never have been kept, that their existence was wrong. And your response? Inspector Marsh asked. I told him to speak with my wife, the vicar said quietly. She handled the records. Miss Marple felt the shape of the matter sharpen further. He intended to raise the issue again? The inspector asked. The vicar nodded. He said he could no longer be responsible for them, that people had a right to know. Inspector Marsh exchanged a glance with Miss Marple. That aligns with what we've seen, he said. As night fell, Little Dinsford retreated behind drawn curtains. Lamps glowed, shadows lengthened, and conversations took place in low voices. People were no longer merely curious. They were uneasy. Miss Marple returned to her lodging and sat with her knitting, her thoughts orderly despite the confusion around her. The pattern, she reflected, was becoming clear. Mr. Hale had been trusted with secrets. He had reached the point where trust felt like a burden rather than privilege. Someone else had feared that moment. The murder was not born of rage, nor even desperation, but of preservation. A decision made quickly by someone accustomed to deciding what should remain unseen. Miss Marple's needles paused briefly. Whoever had acted believed they were protecting something essential: reputation, authority, stability. Such beliefs, she knew, were often far more dangerous than malice. The village slept uneasily that night, unaware that the circle had tightened. The truth was no longer scattered among possibilities. It was drawing inward towards someone who had mistaken control for responsibility, and Miss Marple, quietly attentive as ever, waited for the moment when that mistake would finally reveal itself. By the third day, Little Dinsford had begun to turn on itself, though no one would have admitted it aloud. Politeness remained intact, but it had grown thin, stretched tight over suspicion and unease. People still smiled, still exchanged greetings, yet every interaction carried a careful weight, as though each word might later be examined for meaning. Inspector Marsh continued his inquiries with deliberate patience. He knew this stage well. It was the moment when villagers stopped thinking of the crime as an abstract horror and began imagining how close it might be to them personally. That was when truths, long protected by habit and silence, started to loosen. Miss Marple sensed it too. She spent the morning moving quietly through the village, stopping at the shop, exchanging pleasantries at the post office, listening far more than she spoke. Patterns emerged not from what people said, but from what they avoided. Mr. Rupert Hale, it seemed, had known much more than anyone had previously acknowledged. He kept everything so neatly, the shopkeeper remarked. All those papers. One would never guess what they might contain. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. Order is often comforting, she said, especially when things beneath it are not. The shopkeeper frowned slightly as though the comment unsettled her, then quickly changed the subject. That afternoon, Inspector Marsh requested access to the remaining vicarage records that had not been disturbed. Mrs. Avery agreed with visible reluctance. The boxes were brought out and placed on the dining table under supervision. Their contents were examined slowly, carefully. Miss Marple stood nearby, observing. Much of it was harmless: parish accounts, correspondence about repairs, notes on charitable distributions, but interspersed among them were folders marked with discrete symbols rather than titles. Inside were letters, personal, emotional, often anguished, appeals for discretion, confessions never meant for public ears. In some cases, replies had been drafted but never sent. "These aren't criminal," Inspector Marsh said quietly. "No," Miss Marple replied, "but they are powerful." One folder, however, was conspicuously absent. The missing bundle, the inspector said, the one Mr. Hale had. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, and likely the one he meant to address. That realization shifted the tone of the investigation. Inspector Marsh stopped asking who had opportunity alone, and began asking who had the most to lose. Mr. Brooks was questioned again. This time his irritation was more difficult to disguise. "I don't see why this keeps coming back to me," he snapped. "I've served this parish faithfully for years." "And during those years," the inspector asked, "did you ever confide in Mr. Hale?" Mr. Brooks hesitated. Everyone confided in him. "Yes," Inspector Marsh said. "That's precisely the point." Mr. Brooks's face darkened. He knew things that were none of his business. "Did you ask him to keep something quiet?" the inspector pressed. Mr. Brooks stood abruptly. "This is outrageous." Outrage, Miss Marple reflected, was often the refuge of those whose defences were thinning. Mrs. Penelope Grant proved more revealing, though unintentionally. She spoke freely of her impressions, her observations, her theories, each offered with a bright, confident air. "Mr. Hale was under tremendous strain," she said. "I noticed it immediately. He kept looking over his shoulder, as though he expected someone to appear." "Did he say why?" Inspector Marsh asked. "No," she replied, "but it was obvious he felt trapped." Miss Marple filed the word away. Trapped suggested pressure, not guilt. The most significant conversation, however, came later that evening when Miss Marple found herself alone with Mrs. Avery in the vicarage drawing-room. The house felt hollow now, stripped of its earlier assurance. Mrs. Avery sat stiffly, hands folded, staring at the fire without seeing it. "You must think me dreadful," she said suddenly. Miss Marple shook her head gently. "I think you are a woman who believed she was protecting something important." Mrs. Avery laughed softly, without humour. "The village depends on stability, on trust." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but trust imposed is rarely trusted." Mrs. Avery's fingers tightened. Rupert wanted to expose things, old things, matters that had been settled quietly years ago. "Settled?" Miss Marple echoed. "He said secrecy had become harmful," Mrs. Avery continued. "That keeping those papers was wrong." "And you disagreed," Miss Marple said calmly. Mrs. Avery's voice sharpened. "He didn't understand what would happen if they came out. The damage, the chaos. Or perhaps," Miss Marple suggested gently, "he understood it too well." Silence followed. Mrs. Avery did not look at her. "I never meant for anyone to be hurt," she said finally. Miss Marple believed her. Intent and outcome were rarely aligned. Later, Inspector Marsh confirmed what Miss Marple had already inferred. The missing bundle contained correspondence involving several prominent villagers, including members of the parish council. The letters suggested influence exerted, favours exchanged, reputations quietly shielded. Nothing overtly illegal. Everything is morally precarious. Mr. Hale had been preparing a formal recommendation to destroy the records and disclose their existence to the parish. That would have ended a certain kind of authority, Inspector Marsh said thoughtfully. The kind that thrives on silence. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. And authority rarely surrenders quietly. That night, little Dinsford slept fitfully. Lights burned late, curtains shifted. People imagined footsteps where there were none. The village had begun to recognize itself in the crime, and that recognition was deeply uncomfortable. Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting steadily. The pattern was simple, but it required attention. Lose track for even a moment, and the whole thing faltered. The murder, she reflected, was not the beginning of the mystery, but its consequence. The true story lay in years of quiet decisions, of things recorded instead of forgiven, hidden instead of resolved. Mr. Hale had reached the point where silence felt heavier than exposure. Someone else had reached the point where exposure felt unbearable. Between those two convictions, a blade had been raised, and now, as Inspector Marsh drew closer to the truth, Miss Marple knew the most dangerous moment was approaching. Not the discovery of guilt, but the instant when the guilty realized they were no longer protected by discretion. That was when people made their worst choices. And little Dinsford, for all its calm facades and gentle routines, was no exception at all. By the fourth morning, little Dinsford had reached the point where patience began to fracture. The early politeness remained, but it had acquired sharp edges. People watched one another too closely now, measuring tone and timing, noting who avoided whom and who lingered a moment too long in conversation. The village was no longer united by shock, it was divided by fear of implication. Inspector Marsh adjusted his approach accordingly. He stopped moving from house to house and instead asked people to come to him. The shift was subtle but effective. Familiar rooms had given villagers confidence. The neutral space of the vicarage drawing-room did not. Miss Marple observed the change with interest. Mr. Lionel Brooks arrived first that morning, shoulders squared, expression determined. He answered the inspector's questions briskly, almost eagerly, as though efficiency itself might serve as an alibi. "You've reviewed the remaining records," Inspector Marsh said. "Do you ever see the missing bundle?" Mr. Brooks shook his head too quickly. "No. Rupert kept that sort of thing to himself." "Did you know what it contained?" the inspector asked. "Of course not. Mr. Brooks replied. "I had no reason to, and yet," Inspector Marsh continued mildly, "several letters in the other files reference meetings you attended, decisions that benefited certain individuals." Mr. Brooks flushed. "That's how committees work." "Sometimes," the inspector agreed. "Sometimes it's how influence works." Mr. Brooks bristled. "Are you accusing me of something?" "I'm asking questions," Inspector Marsh said calmly. "You may sit down." Mr. Brooks did so with visible irritation, his confidence diminished but not broken. Mrs. Penelope Grant followed. She was less defensive, more performative. Her concern offered generously in all directions. "It's dreadful for the village," she said, sighing. "Dreadful. And poor Mrs. Avery, she must be beside herself." Inspector Marsh watched her closely. "Do you sympathize with her?" "Of course," Mrs. Grant replied. "She's been under such strain. And yet," he said, "you told me earlier you heard voices in the corridor." "Yes," she said lightly, "but I couldn't tell whose." "Male or female?" he asked. Mrs. Grant hesitated. "I thought, perhaps female. It was sharp, but then I may be mistaken." Miss Marple noticed the shift. Mrs. Grant's uncertainty was becoming directional. After she left, Inspector Marsh leaned back and exhaled slowly. "They're circling," he said. "They feel it." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Villages always do, long before the truth arrives." That afternoon, Inspector Marsh asked Mrs. Avery to join him in the study. Miss Marple remained nearby, ostensibly to fetch tea, though no one questioned her presence. The study looked different now. The disturbance had been recorded, the obvious evidence removed, but the room retained a sense of interruption, as though it had been frozen at the moment something went wrong. "You were responsible for the records," Inspector Marsh said, not unkindly. "Yes," Mrs. Avery replied. "I kept them organized." "And decided what was retained?" he asked. She nodded. "For the good of the parish." "Did Rupert Hale ever object?" the inspector asked. Mrs. Avery's lips tightened. "He became idealistic." "In what way?" Inspector Marsh pressed. "He believed transparency was always virtuous," she said sharply. "He didn't understand the consequences." "Did you?" the inspector asked. Mrs. Avery looked away. Someone had to. Miss Marple watched her closely. Mrs. Avery spoke with conviction, but beneath it was something brittle, something rehearsed. Inspector Marsh opened a folder and slid out a sheet. "This is a draft," he said, "typed but unsigned. It outlines a plan to disclose the existence of certain records and recommend their destruction. It's written in Mr. Hale's style." Mrs. Avery stared at it. "He had no authority." "He believed he had a duty," the inspector replied. Mrs. Avery's composure cracked slightly. "Duty to whom?" "To the people whose lives were recorded without consent," Miss Marple said gently. Mrs. Avery turned sharply. "You don't understand what this village would become without discretion." "Perhaps," Miss Marple replied, "something less tidy. And be more honest." Inspector Marsh allowed the silence to stretch. "Where were you when Mr. Hale went to study?" "I remained with the guests," Mrs. Avery said. "And yet," he continued, "you arrived at the study quickly, faster than others. I was worried," she said. "Worried about him," the inspector said, "or about the papers?" Mrs. Avery's breath caught. "Both." Inspector Marsh nodded slowly. The blade was taken from the kitchen. "You were seen there moments before the sound." Her eyes flickered. "I was preparing more tea." Miss Marple thought of the untouched cups, the forgotten sandwiches. Inspector Marsh closed the folder. "Mrs. Avery, did you confront Mr. Hale?" Mrs. Avery's voice dropped. "I asked him to reconsider." "And when he refused?" the inspector asked quietly. Tears welled, though whether from grief or fear was impossible to tell. He said he would go through with it, that he couldn't keep lying. Miss Marple felt the final piece slide into place. That evening, Inspector Marsh spoke privately with Miss Marple as dusk settled. She believed she was preserving order, he said, that without her the village would unravel. Yes, Miss Marple replied. People who build systems of control often confuse them with stability. She didn't plan to kill, he said, but when he refused, when the papers were in his hand, she panicked, Miss Marple finished gently. Panic born of certainty collapsing. The following morning, Mrs. Avery was arrested quietly. There were no raised voices, no dramatic protest. She went pale, nodded once, and allowed herself to be led away. Little Dinsford watched from behind curtains and half-open doors. Some felt vindicated, others felt betrayed. Many felt both. Miss Marple stood apart, her expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. Mr. Rupert Hale had believed silence had become harmful. Mrs. Avery had believed exposure would become destruction. Between those beliefs lay a single, irrevocable act. The village would speak of it for years. It would soften the story, reshape it, decide what to remember and what to forget. Miss Marple knew better. The true crime had not been committed with a blade, but with years of quiet certainty that some people knew best, and certainty, once challenged, had answered with violence. As the day unfolded, the village began its slow, uneasy return to routine. Miss Marple walked back to her lodging, knitting bag in hand, her mind calm. The mystery was nearly complete. What remained was understanding, and that, she reflected, was always the hardest part. The arrest of Mrs. Avery settled over Little Dinsford like an unexpected frost. It did not bring relief so much as stillness, the kind that followed when people realized that what had been removed had once been central to their sense of order. The vicarage, long a place of quiet authority, now seemed smaller, its presence diminished by the knowledge of what had occurred within its walls. Miss Marple observed the village adjusting, step by careful step. In the days that followed, Inspector Marsh remained to complete his work. He moved without hurry, ensuring that the necessary statements were taken, that procedures were followed with exactness. He understood that the formalities mattered, not only for justice, but for the village's ability to accept what had happened without collapsing into rumor alone. Mrs. Avery offered no resistance. She spoke calmly, her explanations consistent, her belief unwavering that she had acted to prevent something worse. She did not deny the confrontation, nor the moment when fear had overtaken judgment. She spoke of responsibility, of protection, of the unbearable thought of lives undone by old records never meant to be revisited. Miss Marple listened when permitted, and thought how often good intentions became most dangerous when paired with certainty. The vicar withdrew from public view. He conducted services with gentle composure, but his sermons grew shorter, his words less assured. Parishioners watched him with a mixture of sympathy and discomfort, uncertain how much he had known and how much he had allowed. He did not attempt to explain. Miss Marple respected him for that. Explanations, offered too readily, often served the speaker more than the listener. The missing bundle of papers was recovered from the study fireplace, scorched at the edges but not destroyed. Mrs. Avery had attempted to burn them in panic, abandoning the effort when voices approached. Inspector Marsh handled them carefully, their contents already familiar to him in outline. They were, as Miss Marple had suspected, not explosive in the legal sense. No crimes were neatly catalogued. No single revelation would have justified the fear they inspired. Instead, they contained a record of influence, of favors quietly granted, of discretion extended unevenly. They showed how authority had been exercised without oversight, how silence had been mistaken for harmony. "That's what frightened her," Inspector Marsh said quietly when he and Miss Marple discussed them. "Not what they proved, but what they implied." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "implication is often far more powerful than fact." The village responded in subtle ways. People spoke more softly, less from habit than from uncertainty. Some felt anger, others relief, many an uneasy combination of both. A few defended Mrs. Avery openly, insisting she had acted for the good of all. Others avoided her name altogether, as though speaking it might draw uncomfortable parallels. Miss Marple noticed that no one suggested replacing her position quickly. Committees were postponed, decisions deferred. Tasks once handled by a single confident hand were now discussed, sometimes clumsily among several people. Efficiency suffered. Awareness grew. One afternoon, Miss Penelope Grant stopped Miss Marple outside the shop. "I never imagined," she said, lowering her voice, "that something like this could happen here." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "That belief is usually what allows it to." Miss Grant frowned. "You make it sound as though it was inevitable." "Not inevitable," Miss Marple said gently, "but prepared for." Mr. Lionel Brooks resigned his role as churchwarden soon after. He cited fatigue and the need for reflection. The village accepted this with minimal comment. There were many who preferred not to examine too closely why his departure felt like a relief. Inspector Marsh met Miss Marple for tea on his final evening in Little Dinsford. He looked tired, but thoughtful. "She confessed without dramatics," he said. "She said she acted to preserve stability." "And do you believe her?" Miss Marple asked. "I believe she believed it," he replied. "That's the troubling part." Miss Marple nodded. People rarely act with villainy in mind. They act with justification. They always do, the inspector agreed. As he prepared to leave the next morning, Inspector Marsh paused at the vicarage gate and looked back at the quiet street. "This village will recover," he said. "They always do." "Yes," Miss Marple replied, "but not quite as they were." That evening Miss Marple sat by the window of her lodging, knitting steadily. The rhythm soothed her thoughts. She considered the shape of what had occurred, how neatly it followed a pattern she had seen many times before. A system created to manage discomfort had grown into a mechanism of control. When challenged, it had answered not with conversation, but with force. Mr. Hale had reached a point where silence felt dishonest. Mrs. Avery had reached a point where exposure felt catastrophic. Between those convictions lay the fatal moment when one person decided they must decide for everyone else. The village would soften the story in time. Mrs. Avery would become a tragic figure, Mr. Hale a cautionary one. The papers would be spoken of obliquely, their contents fading into suggestion. Memory would arrange itself into something tolerable. Miss Marple knew that was the village way, yet she also knew that something had shifted. A pause now existed where certainty once rushed forward. A question lingered where acceptance had been automatic. Those small changes mattered more than any public reckoning. As night settled over Little Dinsford, Miss Marple finished her knitting and set it aside. Outside, the village slept with the fragile confidence of a place that believed it had learned something important, though it could not yet name it. The mystery, she reflected, had not ended with the arrest, nor even with the explanation. It ended in the quieter realization that attention could not be delegated without consequence, that understanding, once gained, was never entirely lost, and Miss Marple, content in her unobtrusive role, allowed herself a small, thoughtful smile as the lights dimmed across the village and the long work of remembering began. In the weeks that followed Inspector Marsh's departure, Little Dinsford entered a period of careful reassembly. Life resumed its familiar outlines, but with subtle differences that Miss Marple found quietly instructive. Doors still opened onto tidy lanes. The shop still rang its bell for customers, and the church still gathered its congregation each Sunday. Yet beneath these continuities lay a hesitation that had not existed before, a collective awareness that certainty had once been misplaced. Miss Marple noticed it first in conversation. People spoke with a new tentativeness, often beginning sentences only to revise them midway, as though hearing their own words with unfamiliar ears. Opinions were offered as possibilities rather than conclusions. Advice came wrapped in questions. It was not that the village had become wiser overnight, but that it had become less comfortable with unquestioned authority. The vicarage stood quiet and partially shuttered. Mrs. Avery's absence left a hollow that no one seemed eager to fill. Her belongings were removed discreetly, without commentary, and the study remained closed for some time, its door a silent reminder of interruption. When it was finally opened again, it was for inventory rather than use, and even then, people entered the room with caution, as though the air itself retained memory. The recovered papers were taken away under official supervision. Their removal produced an odd mixture of relief and regret. Some villagers felt safer knowing they no longer existed. Others felt vaguely bereft, as though a hidden structure that had once supported them had been dismantled without replacement. Miss Marple reflected that control often masqueraded as comfort until it was gone. Committees were reorganized with deliberate care. Responsibilities that had once been centralized were now distributed among several people, sometimes inefficiently, often awkwardly. Decisions took longer, disagreements surfaced, yet for all the frustration, Miss Marple sensed a growing resilience. The village was learning to tolerate disorder without immediately seeking someone to impose order upon it. One afternoon, Miss Marple encountered Miss Edith Farnham near the post office. The woman looked tired, but thoughtful. "I keep thinking," Miss Farnham said slowly, "about how much we trusted her, about how relieved we were not to have to think too hard ourselves." "Yes," Miss Marple replied gently, "relief can be a powerful incentive." Miss Farnham sighed. "I don't think I want that kind of relief again." Miss Marple smiled faintly and said nothing more. The vicar, for his part, continued his duties with quiet humility. His sermons focused less on guidance and more on reflection. He spoke of listening, of shared responsibility, of the dangers of certainty untempered by compassion. Some parishioners found the change unsettling, others found it necessary. No one, Miss Marple observed, found it entirely comfortable. Mr. Lionel Brooks's resignation was accepted without ceremony. His departure removed a presence that many had come to associate with firmness and efficiency. In its absence, people discovered that firmness without accountability had been part of the problem. The realization was not universally welcomed, but it was increasingly difficult to ignore. Miss Penelope Grant, who had once seemed invigorated by the drama of village life, grew quieter. Her observations became less pointed, her curiosity less performative. She remained interested, certainly, but Miss Marple noticed that she now listened more than she spoke. Experience, Miss Marple knew, had a way of rearranging priorities. As autumn deepened, the village prepared for its seasonal events with cautious cooperation. The decorations were modest. Plans were discussed openly, sometimes revised several times before agreement was reached. Mistakes were made and corrected without assigning blame. It was slower, messier, and, Miss Marple thought, healthier. One evening, as she walked past the green, Miss Marple heard laughter rising from the village hall. The sound was uneven, unpracticed, and genuine. Inside, people were arranging chairs for a small gathering, moving them back and forth until no one could quite remember who had suggested what. There was no single figure directing the effort. It took longer than it once would have, but it worked. At home later, Miss Marple sat by her window with her knitting and considered the arc of the events. Mr. Hale had been killed not because he was malicious or ambitious, but because he had reached a moral boundary and refused to step back from it. Mrs. Avery had crossed a different boundary, convinced that protection justified action, even when that action silenced another permanently. Neither had believed themselves capable of evil. That, Miss Marple reflected, was the most instructive lesson of all. The village would remember the murder, of course. It would tell the story with softened edges, emphasizing shock and tragedy, rather than the slow accumulation of choices that had made it possible. Time would blur details, memory would become selective, yet something essential had shifted, something that resisted erasure. There was now a pause where once there had been certainty, a question where once there had been acceptance. Those pauses and questions were fragile, easily dismissed, but they existed nonetheless. As dusk settled, Miss Marple finished her knitting and set it aside. Outside, Little Dinsford glowed softly, windows lit against the darkening sky. It looked peaceful, almost unchanged, and that appearance would reassure many. Miss Marple knew better. Peace built on attention, she believed, was sturdier than peace built on silence. The village had learned that lesson at a high cost. Whether it would remember it permanently was uncertain, but permanence was not required for meaning. Sometimes a single interruption was enough to alter a pattern. Miss Marple sipped her tea and watched the last light fade. For now, Little Dinsford was learning to live without the comfort of someone else deciding what was best. It was uncomfortable, imperfect, and entirely necessary. She returned to her knitting, the needles moving with steady care. Attention, after all, was a habit, and habits, once learned, had a way of returning when they were needed most. As winter approached, Little Dinsford settled into a quieter, more inward-looking rhythm. Frost traced the edges of the lanes in the mornings, and smoke rose steadily from chimneys as villagers retreated earlier into their homes. To an outsider, the village might have seemed unchanged, but Miss Marple knew that something essential had shifted beneath the familiar routines. What lingered most was a new attentiveness. People noticed one another differently now. They noticed who spoke quickly and who hesitated, who volunteered information and who avoided it. Silence was no longer assumed to be harmless. It was weighed, considered, sometimes challenged. The village had not become wiser exactly, but it had become less certain, and Miss Marple regarded that as progress. The vicarage remained subdued. Rooms were cleaned and aired, yet no one rushed to restore the study to its former purpose. The desk stayed bare. The shelves, once crowded with papers and files, held only a few carefully chosen books. When asked about the change, the vicar merely said that some spaces benefited from restraint. His congregation listened with mixed reactions, but no one contradicted him openly. Miss Marple attended services regularly, sitting near the back as she always did. She observed how the sermons had changed in tone. There were fewer instructions, fewer assurances. Instead, the vicar spoke of responsibility shared rather than imposed, of judgment tempered by humility. Some parishioners found this shift unsettling. Others found it quietly relieving. After one service, Miss Marple walked home with Mrs. Leonard, who had been unusually thoughtful of late. "I keep thinking about Mr. Hale," Mrs. Leonard said, "about how he must have felt carrying all that." "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "Secrets are a burden when they are not freely given." Mrs. Leonard nodded. "And Mrs. Avery, I don't know whether to feel angry or sorry." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Those feelings are not mutually exclusive." The village committees continued their slow reorganization. No single person took control. Decisions were debated, postponed, revisited. There were moments of frustration, even irritation, but Miss Marple noticed something encouraging. People stayed. They did not retreat at the first sign of disagreement. They learned, awkwardly and imperfectly, how to listen. Efficiency, once prized above all else, had lost some of its shine. One evening, Miss Marple received a short note from Inspector Marsh. The legal proceedings were moving forward. Mrs. Avery had repeated her account without variation, still framing her actions as necessary, still convinced that chaos had been narrowly avoided. The recovered papers were being catalogued for final review before destruction. Most, he wrote, would never be seen again. Miss Marple folded the note and placed it carefully away. She did not believe destruction alone resolved anything. but she understood the need to remove objects that had acquired an unhealthy power. As December deepened, preparations for the holidays began. Decorations appeared gradually, modest and understated. Plans were discussed openly, sometimes revised several times before agreement was reached. There was no single organizer this year, no firm guiding hand. It took longer. Mistakes were made, laughter followed. Miss Marple approved. One afternoon she paused outside the village hall, where voices drifted through an open door. Inside, a small group was arranging chairs, moving them back and forth with mild disagreement. "No, that blocks the aisle, but if we move them no one can see properly." "Well, what do you suggest?" Miss Marple continued on her way, smiling faintly. The sound was not of disorder, but of participation. At home she sat by the window with her knitting, and reflected on the path that had led little Dinsford here. Mr. Hale had reached the point where silence felt dishonest, where discretion had become complicity. Mrs. Avery had reached a different conclusion, believing that exposure would unravel the village she had spent years maintaining. Both had acted from conviction. It was that conviction, Miss Marple knew, that had made the tragedy possible. Not malice, not cruelty, but certainty unchallenged by doubt or dialogue. Outside, dusk fell early, the sky darkening to a deep winter blue. Lights came on in windows one by one, each marking a household settling into its evening. The village looked peaceful, almost unchanged, and many would take comfort in that appearance. Miss Marple knew better. She knew that the most important changes were rarely visible. They lived in pauses, in questions left open rather than closed too quickly, in the quiet decision to listen instead of assume. Those changes were fragile, easily eroded by time and convenience, but they existed now, and that mattered. She finished her knitting and set it aside, the pattern complete. It was not perfect. One or two stitches were slightly uneven. Miss Marple regarded it with satisfaction. Perfection, she had learned long ago, often concealed more than it revealed. The mystery of the Vicarage murder had been solved in the formal sense. A name had been given, a motive explained, a sequence established. Yet its deeper lesson would unfold more slowly, woven into the daily life of the village. Whether little Dinsford would remember that lesson indefinitely was uncertain. Villages, like people, preferred comfort to reflection. But perhaps, Miss Marple thought, a trace would remain. A moment of hesitation before judgment. A reluctance to hand authority too readily to one confident voice. She poured herself a cup of tea and let it cool, watching the steam rise and fade. Outside, the village settled into night, quiet and watchful. For now, that watchfulness was enough, and Miss Marple, content in her unobtrusive role, remained attentive, knowing that attention itself was often the surest safeguard of all. By the time Christmas arrived in Little Dinsford, the village had settled into a version of itself that felt familiar, yet subtly altered, like a room rearranged just enough to make one hesitate before moving through it. Snow fell lightly, softening edges and muting sound, and the lanes curved away under pale coverings that demanded slower steps and careful balance. Miss Marple approved of this enforced attentiveness. Winter, she had always thought, was a season that rewarded those who paid heed. The church service on Christmas Eve was modest and quietly attended. Candles flickered, hymns rose without polish, and the vicar spoke briefly of humility and shared responsibility. He did not mention loss directly, nor did he speak of forgiveness in grand terms. Instead, he spoke of listening, of the dangers of certainty, and of the small courage required to admit one might be wrong. The congregation listened in thoughtful silence. No one hurried to interpret his words for anyone else. Afterward, people lingered outside longer than usual, exchanging greetings that felt less automatic and more considered. Miss Marple observed the way conversations unfolded, with pauses allowed rather than hurried past. It was not harmony exactly, but it was something steadier. The vicarage remained quiet that evening, its windows dark, its rooms unoccupied. The study, once the heart of so much unseen authority, had been emptied and repurposed as a simple sitting room. The desk was gone. The shelves were bare. Miss Marple passed the gate slowly and reflected that absence could sometimes be as instructive as presence. Over the following days, life resumed in gentle increments. Visits were paid, gifts exchanged, small gatherings took place without anyone assuming command. The village hall hosted a modest seasonal meeting, arranged by shared effort rather than direction. Chairs were set unevenly, programs revised at the last minute, and nothing proceeded quite according to plan. Yet there was laughter, and when disagreements arose, they were addressed rather than deferred. Miss Marple attended, sitting quietly near the back. She was content to observe how the village managed without the familiar comfort of someone else deciding what was best. One afternoon, she received a final letter from Inspector Marsh. The legal matters were concluded. Mrs. Avery's account had been accepted, her actions understood though not excused. The papers recovered from the vicarage had been formally destroyed, their existence recorded only in the official case file. He wrote that the village would, in time, forget the details, but he suspected it would remember the feeling. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully and placed it away. Feelings, she knew, often endured longer than facts. As the year drew to a close, little Dinsford prepared for the turn of it with subdued anticipation. There was talk of resolutions, of beginnings, of leaving certain habits behind. Some of these intentions would fade quickly, others might linger, shaping choices in small, nearly invisible ways. Miss Marple walked the lanes one evening, the sky clear and sharp with stars. Windows glowed warmly against the dark, each a separate world, each held together by the quiet understanding that no single house spoke for all the others. She paused at the green, listening to the faint sounds of voices drifting from different directions, uncoordinated yet peaceful. At home she lit her lamp and settled into her chair, knitting resting lightly in her hands. She thought again of Mr. Hale, whose careful stewardship of secrets had become an unbearable weight, and of Mrs. Avery, whose certainty that she alone could protect the village had led her to silence another permanently. Neither had set out to destroy. Both had believed they were acting responsibly. That, Miss Marple reflected, was what made the tragedy so instructive. The mystery had never truly been about documents or knives or even motives in the narrow sense. It had been about the slow accumulation of unchecked authority, about the relief of letting someone else decide what was acceptable, what was dangerous, what must remain unseen. When that authority was challenged, it had answered with violence. Understanding this did not undo the harm, but it clarified it. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the needles moving with steady rhythm. Each stitch required attention. Miss won, and the pattern faltered. Patterns, whether of yarn or of human behavior, demanded the same care. They could not be rushed, nor could responsibility be handed off without consequence. Outside, the village slept under its winter calm, believing itself restored. Miss Marple knew that restoration was never complete, nor should it be. What mattered was the habit that had begun to form, however tentatively, the habit of noticing, of questioning, of refusing to accept comfort without examination. In spring, little Dinsford would look much as it always had. Flowers would bloom along the lanes, the green would fill with familiar routines, visitors would remark on how peaceful it seemed. Those who lived there would nod and agree and perhaps mean it, but Miss Marple hoped that beneath that peace something would remain altered, a pause before judgment, a question asked aloud rather than swallowed, a reluctance to hand power too readily to those who claimed to know best. She set her knitting aside and finished her tea, now long cooled. The year was ending, and with it a chapter the village would remember in fragments and softened retellings. That was as it should be. Memory needed shaping to survive. Yet somewhere within those softened stories, Miss Marple trusted that a sharper truth would persist, that attention was not a luxury but a duty, that certainty required scrutiny, and that the quiet work of watching, listening, and thinking was never truly finished. With that thought, she turned out the lamp and allowed the house to settle around her, content in the knowledge that the mystery at last had reached its proper end.